So I was checking up on the results of the British Chess Championship earlier today because the final round is happening right now. And while I was doing that, I saw a familiar name of Supratit Banerjee who was doing very well. And the reason that I recognized this guy because I actually played him 2 years ago when he was aged 9. So I checked up to see how he had such a great score and saw that he played none other than Grandmaster Simon Williams, also known as Ginger GM. And let me tell you, the game that he played against him was nothing short of a positional masterpiece. So that's why in this video we're going to be covering that game and also my game against Supratit himself, so if you'd be interested in that then stick around to the end. So his game against Ginger GM started off in absolute crazy fashion. We got a French defense, Tarrasch, which means you know you're going to get some funkiness in a closed position. We see f4, c5 striking back against white's center, and pawn to c3, simply reinforcing it. Knight c6 adding more pressure, and he plays knight d over to f3, so that you can potentially put this knight here and add even more support. Whereas if you were to develop this one, then you can't add any more support. So this move makes a lot of sense, and it's top theory. Queen b6 was played, and now he goes for h4. And h4 is truly some funky new age stuff. H4, the point is that he just wants to take some space on the queen side and get this kind of backwards bathtub structure against black's pawns, which will be advantageous in all endgames. So there's one capture here, another capture there, and the center is simplified. We see a5. He's taking space on the queen side, potentially outposting some pieces over here, also maybe just wanting to nibble away at white's queen side like this. But now comes king to f2. And this is the first of the king walk. All of these pieces could be developed, but no, he chooses to play king to f2 and king to g3. Now, checking this actually is a theoretical move. It's not very common, but the idea is that the king is extremely safe on the g3 square, and he doesn't really want to castle because he wants to leave the rook here. So very, very interesting and pioneering stuff from the 11-year-old. We see a4, he's just pushing down on the king side is Simon, and now king to g3. So the king has vacated the premises and safely found haven on the g3 square. I mean, if I got to play this in an over-the-board game, I mean, my opponents would just look at me like I am an idiot. But because this guy's doing it and he's such a strong prodigy, I would honestly be absolutely terrified. But anyway, Simon continues with a3. He's now pounding down on the queen side, trying to loosen things up a little bit because it's such a locked position. And we get rook to b1, just defending the pawn and also lining up the rook with the queen. The queen retreats back. Queen c2, once again lining up with the queen, stopping the knight from moving here. And there's a capture here, rook captures, and bishop to a3. Just attacking the rook and x-raying the bishop. Rook goes back, there's an exchange, and queen to a5. And the most important thing to notice about this position is that while black is, yes, going to win this pawn here, the endgame actually may favor white. And the reason for that is because look at these pawns, all on the dark squares, and black maintains the bad French bishop. So white's bishop is going to be a great piece, and black's bishop is not going to be a very good piece, which means that white can simply increase pressure on the pawn and stuff like this, and hopefully white's going to try and get a good position. So he continues knight e2. He wants to go knight to c3, knight to b5, and drive that knight into this d6 outpost square. Black has very juicy and accessible outposts, while white's outpost is impossible to reach because the pawn is covering all of the knight jumps that you might want to get there with. Simon collects the pawn on a2, we see a trade, and knight to c3. Supratit is simply continuing with his plan. He's going to drive the pony into d6. The rook goes to b2, knight to b5, guarded by the bishop, king up to e2, and knight to d6. The knight has successfully made it to this absolute power position, exerting pressure on all of the black weaknesses and supporting future pawn thrusts with something like f5, which is going to be white's main way to break through. And you might think that white has absolutely no business winning this, like white's down a pawn, how's he going to do this? All the pawns are on the same side of the board. But the way that Supratit gathers his pieces in this game is nothing short of brilliant, and he does it in such a controlled way. So knight to b6, bishop comes out. He trades off one pair of rooks because that's normally quite a good idea. When you're trying to push for the win, you want to exchange one set of rooks so that you are unable to get checkmated, and it reduces the opponent's counterplay. Knight goes back to d8 because Simon wants to exchange off his bad light square bishop, but Supratit understands that this trade is actually very good for him, and he doesn't cash in early with the draw with something like knight takes on b7. This would be a pretty much instant draw. No, instead he goes knight to c8 check. He's maintaining a bind on the position with h5 now. taking even more space on the king side and trying to make it hard to set up a fortress. If you gave black a couple more moves and they could play h5 and g6, then black would have a fortress here and there's no way to break through and make progress. But instead, he plays pawn to h5, so that now you can only go h6, and any g6 move can be met with h6, which just completely restricts the position and would make this a forever weakness. So let's just imagine a position like this, with g6, h6, and the rook going here, the knight going here. Now this pawn is forever a weak pawn, and you'll have to guard it passively with either the rook or the king, which means that white will simply be up a rook or a king, and white will be able to push this for the win. So Simon is obviously scared of this pawn push, and he plays pawn to h6 himself. According to the engine, this is another mistake, but it's very, very hard to say. The engine now gives pawn to f5 as a winning move, because after you capture the pawn, there would have been rook to b5 going after this pawn here, and there's no good way to protect it. Even then, there's still some calculation to be had with something like f4, and after king takes on f4, knight to e6 check, so it's not super simple. Instead, we see the move king to f2. This 11-year-old is playing with the patience of an old man that's been playing chess for 40 plus years. King to f2, he says, no, I'm going to just improve this f5 pawn push and make it even stronger. There's no need to rush. After knight goes back to b8, what's he meant to do? I mean, he's just kind of maneuvering his pieces around the board. The king can't go back up and allow the rook into the game, which is making the back position very passive. The engine said that black had to lash out with something like g5. It had to strike, but here f5 taking on f5 and rook to b5 once again looks pretty difficult for black to hold. So knight to b8, knight goes back to d6, now supporting this f5 pawn push. King to e7, king to e3, rook g8, g4, like I said, he's reinforcing this f5 pawn push. He has absolutely no interest in cashing in with the b pawn, he just wants to win on the king side with this steamroll. And the second that Simon takes a step forward with his structure, now comes the time to strike pawn to f5. Turns out g5 might have been slightly better, but with something like this, with the h-pawn trying to run through, but at the same time, it's quite difficult to say. You'd have to calculate all of this and see that, okay, now the h-pawn survives. And if they go like this, then you have to see f6 and king to f8. And then you have to decide whether or not this position is a win, which apparently it is after knight g5. But honestly, it's not particularly clear to me. It looks like black's defending their position quite well. But supposedly the rook goes to g1, knight c6, and the knight sacrifices on f7. And this is a forced win after knight takes on e6. Pretty long and suspicious line, and the players are getting very low on time. So he plays the practical move pawn to f5, which is pretty much guaranteed to be good without much calculation. So we see a trade, another trade, another trade, and now the knight takes it. And at this point, he is now picking up the h6 pawn and is going to push Harry to victory, much to the dismay of Ginger GM. So king goes up to e6, knight takes on h6, and now this really funny move, knight to f5. This is just typical tricks from the young man. King takes on f5 is met with knight to h4, a very nice spot. So he rescues the knight with a tactic and plays king to f4. Cool, calm, and collected. The two ponies are now guarded by the king, which by the way has gone here, and then here. So the king's done a little dance around the board and is now very active. Meanwhile, the two black knights are super passive, and white simply has a winning position at this point with the outside passed h-pawn. He tries f6 to break things up a little bit, but now comes h6. The pawn is marching down the board, knight comes up, knight goes to g7, king f7, and he continues marching up the board. One more trade, another trade, but at this point the game is completely winning. Rook to b6, guards the pawn from the side, very nice lateral defense. King e7, and king g6, supporting the pawn push once again. This knight is totally dominated, guarding this terribly weak pawn on b7 the whole game. By the way, what I love so much about this game is that the weak pawn that was constantly being threatened to get captured, he never actually took. And this is a beautiful illustration of the threat is stronger than the execution. He didn't cash in too early. He played with impeccable patience. And after the king goes here, he just gives a check, captures the pawn, which is actually quite valuable and could go on the run. And after the king goes up, one more check, pawn pushes, knight c6, and the finishing blow, rook takes on c6, absolutely killer. Now there's no more play, this pawn is promoting, and this pawn will win the game. So in this position, Ginger GM resigned the game because after pawn takes it, e7, here, queens, takes it, here, here. Turns out white queens first, check, picks up the pawn, and I have absolutely no doubts that our friend would be able to deliver a checkmate up a queen and a knight. So a really, really beautiful game from Supratit. And for those of you who made it this far, you might have been interested in seeing my game against him, which is almost 3 years ago now that I think about it. I think he was 8 or 9 at the time that we played this game, which is quite funny. But I was basically groveling the entire time. This was a Sicilian, he played the Alapin, I played d6, and got a pretty horrible position out of the opening. I can't really explain to you why I didn't take with the bishop here. I absolutely should have. I took with the pawn, played e6, he had the full center, and just fast forwarding, I did have the 2 bishops, but he was totally dominating me with the squares that his isolated queen's pawn controlled, and I just castled. I exchanged off one more time, and look at this, look at this. Really common theme, by the way, between the 2 games, which is quite interesting. I have this miserable light square bishop. Ginger GM also had his miserable light square bishop, so clearly he likes these positional binds quite a lot. I played bishop e8, f6, and then slightly improved the bishop to this square. Managed to trade off the knights, which I thought was quite important. And eventually I managed to exchange off the rook as well. And I sacrificed this pawn here on f7 so that I could activate my bishop. Managed to get a couple more trades and also grovel this final position for a draw. We did a lot of shuffling around. I was very, very low on the clock here, but managed to hold the position and eventually enter this opposite color bishop ending, which was just a dead draw. So that was the game that I got to play against him. Clearly, he's improved significantly since our match, and I would definitely be interested to see how he improves in the future as another British chess prodigy. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching this far. Let me know if there's any other games from the British Chess Championship that you guys have seen that you think might be interesting and might want me to cover on this channel. But other than all of that, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!